This is how it feels to be Obi-Wan Kenobi. On Tatooine, the heat of the twin suns scorches your skin, but it doesn't come close to the heat you felt when you watched the flames of Mustafar claim what remained of your brother. The arid wind parches your throat, but it doesn't compare to the dehydration caused by your own tears each night, before your ears rung with the sound of cannon fire across 100 worlds. But there, in the desert, the deafening silence makes you long for the days of battle. Because at least when you stood shoulder to shoulder with your comrades, you weren't so completely and utterly alone. This was the life of Obi-Wan Kenobi during his years in exile. There is a distinct difference between Jedi General Obi-Wan Kenobi and old Ben Kenobi, and that difference did not come from gray hairs, it came from 19 years of isolation, reflection, and grief. To say that Kenobi's sense of self deconstructed would be false. It was dashed to pieces, and when he tried to put it back, he found that the pieces no longer fit together. But in the process of wrestling with the memories and repairing his identity, he never stopped being a Jedi Master. And wherever a Jedi is, trouble will always find them. The exile of Obi-Wan Kenobi cannot be fully captured in a single show or book, but it is told across many mediums, and in today's Holocron documentary, we carefully dusted the sand off of old Ben Kenobi's journals and transcribed his journeys from self-imprisonment to risen conviction. In keeping with our usual MO, we'll be focusing exclusively on Legends and its continuity for his exile, so neither the events of the Disney Obi-Wan Kenobi series nor Star Wars Rebels episodes will be documented in this video. With that said, let us begin. A long time ago, in a galaxy far, far away. Chapter 1, Sands of Sorrow. That wizard's just a crazy old man. I don't think he exists anymore. He died about the same time as your father. Owen Lars may have lied to Luke about many things, but this wasn't exactly one of them. Obi-Wan Kenobi was dead, and it happened within the first year of his arrival to the desert world. Bail Organa had given him a stipend of untraceable credits to provide for the journey, and for Obi-Wan's settlement on the planet. As soon as he touched down, trouble found him. First at the spaceport and then at a cantina not too long afterward. At the spaceport, two ruffians had gotten into a scuffle. One threw a bottle at the other, and the bottle would have landed on a young Luke had Obi-Wan not caught it. Using his Jedi reflexes, he ended up having to put one of the ruffians to sleep with a Jedi mind trick in order to avoid the man's suspicion. But with hollows of Emperor Palpatine announcing bounties for Jedi, Obi-Wan knew that he could not allow this to happen again. One single slip-up is all that it would take. The cantina incident occurred when Obi-Wan stopped by Anchorhead to ask for simple directions. Still holding the infant Luke Skywalker in his arms, he was conversing with the barkeeper when a group of hooligans came into the bar to cause more trouble. Kenobi did his best to stay out of it, until they ended up causing a bar fight with a nearby Wookiee. One thing led to the next, and blasters were drawn by a pair of nearby thugs. Unable to hold himself back, Obi-Wan hands the infant off and leaps into action. He first takes out the lights and ignites his lightsaber. Within a matter of seconds, it was all over. The hooligans were run out of the bar, the blaster-wielding thugs were dead, and the cantina was a mess. It was after this that Obi-Wan delivered the son of Anakin Skywalker to Owen and Beru Lars, and thus his exile officially began. Sitting upon an Eopai, the Jedi Master watched from afar as the Lars stared off into the twin suns with the newest addition to their family. Here began his first meditations with Qui-Gon Jinn, whose voice he had not heard since Yoda's instruction on Palis Massa. He told Qui-Gon that his mission was now complete, and that he was going to live somewhere far out of the way. Trouble seemed to follow him, so he didn't want to live too close to the Lars homestead. Obi-Wan was also wary about urban areas such as Anchorhead, where beings and things moved quickly. The spaceport and the cantina had proved that he was too tempted to get involved, and for Luke's own safety and his, he could no longer react as Obi-Wan Kenobi. He resolved to live in isolation along the edge of the Jundland Wastes, and to do his best to mind his own business. It was out there where he found a small, decrepit hut, one long abandoned and forgotten, just as he had desired that it would be. For a while, he would stalk around the Lars home, keeping as close an eye on them and Luke. But soon enough, Owen ran him off. He shared Obi-Wan's opinion that the Jedi presence would only invite trouble. He also placed the blame of what happened to Anakin squarely on Obi-Wan. From the farmer's perspective, he saw the life of a Jedi as nothing but pain and problems. Owen wanted Luke to experience a normal life, and so kept Obi-Wan at a distance always. He felt he could take care of the Tuskens himself, and that if Obi-Wan wanted to protect them from the Empire, the best thing that he could do would be to keep his distance permanently. The Jedi Master understood, but it didn't stop him from checking up on them every once in a while. Obi-Wan Kenobi's first few weeks were used searching for alternatives to monitoring the Lars. Everything moved slowly for Obi-Wan at first. He was hyper-vigilant at remaining totally untraceable. There was a temptation to send a message to Bail Organa using their private channel communicator, but he refrained as much as possible. In Obi-Wan's opinion, the less transmissions going out, the better. Kenobi also refused to use a speeder. He feared using any sort of electronic method of travel would enable someone from orbit to track his movements. And so, he preferred exclusively riding on the Eopai, even though it was much slower. Eventually, he would barter for passage from the Jawa sandcrawlers. They had taken notice of the man moving into the Jundland Wastes and stopped to trade with him. By trading them good food he caught for supplies, he garnered a good relationship with them. The Jawa chief then offered to give him rides on the sandcrawlers if he ever needed one. To do dealings with the locals, Obi-Wan would call himself Ben. This was a nickname once given to him by Duchess Satine of Mandalore, by whom he had almost had a romantic relationship with. During his youth, he had been assigned to protect for a time with his master Qui-Gon, and the young Jedi and the Duchess developed a close relationship, as Satine teasingly began calling him Ben. Obi-Wan would later use this nickname during the Clone Wars as a secret call sign when he went undercover. On Tatooine, he was reminded of the name when he was viewing a map and saw a mesa by the name of Ben. In one of his meditations, he mentions this to Qui-Gon, thinking it would amuse his deceased master. So now, it felt natural to use it as his permanent name. But of course the difference here is that Obi-Wan did not consider himself to merely be undercover. He had officially begun a brand new life. Obi-Wan fully anticipated that he would spend the rest of his days there on Tatooine until he could train Luke. This was the sacrifice he and Yoda both agreed to make for the sake of the galaxy. Only the new hope of the Skywalker children could bring balance to the Force. As for the Jedi of old, their time was over, evidenced by the fact that they were, to their knowledge, the last of the Jedi Order. Though for a while, Obi-Wan refused to believe it. He held out hope that more Jedi had to have made it into hiding. Perhaps the notion that he was truly alone, not just on Tatooine, but in the galaxy, was too crushing. Kenobi would spend a significant amount of time reflecting on the past, both in the first few weeks and in his entire exile. He would violate every Jedi tenet about mindfulness of the present and accepting what was. Years into the future, Leia would visit Ben's hut, and for a while she was sitting outside of it, she could still feel the lingering waves of grief through the Force, all of the time that Kenobi had spent there contemplating the past. Obi-Wan would regularly hold Anakin's lightsaber in his hands and stare at it, obsessively going over every conversation he had with his Padawan. In his mind, he reframed them, worded his feelings and teachings better so that it got across what he had always wanted but had failed to say. In his imagination, Anakin listened and understood, but it was only in his imagination. He would mentally list out all of his mistakes, think about everything he could have done better. Soon he came to the belief that Qui-Gon Jinn should have been the one to train Anakin from the very beginning, and even adopted Owen's point of view, blaming himself, Obi-Wan Kenobi, for everything. Many of his first nights were filled with nightmares. The security hollow of Anakin murdering the younglings replayed itself over and over again in his dreams. He couldn't wipe the sight of their dead bodies from his memory. Each laceration upon them had been dealt by the same lightsaber he had trained the murderer to wield, the same lightsaber that now rested in a wooden box within the hut. His nightmares were also bathed in the heat and the red light of Mustafar. The smell of the sulfur and smoke would never leave his nostrils, nor would the sight of the flames chewing Anakin's flesh leave his eyes. Of course, at this point, Obi-Wan fully believed that Anakin was dead. Not metaphorically either. He was certain that Darth Vader had been destroyed on Mustafar that day. According to the Revenge of the Sith novelization, he had purposefully left Anakin's fate up to the will of the Force. But in that process, he assumed that the Force deemed Skywalker worthy for execution. And to be honest, how could he not? Even as powerful as Anakin was, not even he should have survived what happened to him. Had Sidious not found him and used his obscene power, Anakin would have perished on that black sand beach. But as of now, Obi-Wan was none the wiser that Vader had survived, and so he was in a state of deep mourning for his friend. His mind wandered to Padme's final words, "There is still good in him," and Obi-Wan often contemplated whether or not Anakin could have been redeemed, and if he was right to have left him there to burn. Very often, Ben would meditate and speak a message to Qui-Gon, keeping his master updated on all of his movements, but he would receive nothing in return. Out there in the desert, it wasn't just dry wind towing along the silence. Soon, Ben wondered if Qui-Gon was even listening, or if he was truly, totally isolated. For a while, his only company was his Eopai, named Rue. But things began to change one day when he was on his way home from Bestine. Out in the desert, he happened across a woman by the name of Annalene Caldwell and her daughter, who were helplessly trying to wrangle a crazed dewback. The dewback was charging wildly with the daughter helplessly on its back. Annalene was riding alongside the girl. They were headed for an area of land pocket-marked with deep holes where sarlaccs often nested. Unable to resist helping, Ben Kenobi rode up to them and rescued the two women from the rampaging dewback. In the process, he ended up having to use the Force to save Annalene. The dewback's leg had hit a pothole, sending both her and the beast careening to the ground. The dewback would have landed on her with all of its bulk had Obi-Wan not reached out and moved it through the air so that it landed away from her. In the excitement, neither the woman nor her daughter saw Kenobi's display of the Force, but one being did. Hiding among the crags some distance away was a Tusken Raider war chief called Aark, who had become infamous around the area for being one of the most crafty and dangerous Tuskens. Upon seeing this display of sorcery, Aark mistook what happened, believing that Annalene had used magic to save herself. Worried that this was a new trick from the settlers, Aark resolved to kill the woman before she could teach the other settlers magic as well. Annalene, grateful for both her life and her daughter's, invited Ben to her trade shop that they called the Claim. It was much closer to Ben's residence than the other settlements, therefore more convenient to shop for supplies, and Annalene felt that she owed the Wanderer a great debt. Ben was hesitant to get involved with the locals, but he needed supplies for his currently run-down hut. Unbeknownst to either of them, this would be the beginning of a meaningful friendship. A few days later, Kenobi arrives at the Pika Oasis, the location of the Claim. There, he meets other settlers who formed a posse to keep the Tusken Raiders at bay. Their leader, Oren Galt, had developed a network of alarms known as the Settler's Call, which were raised whenever the Sand People began raiding the farms. These alarms mimicked the sound of a Krayt Dragon in order to scare away the Tuskens. Once the alarms were raised, Oren, his adult children, and the large group of fellow armed farmers would arrive in speeders in order to kill or chase away the Sand People. The Galt family and the Caldwell family were very close and used the Claim as a sort of home base. During this season, they'd been terrorized by a specific Tusken they called Plug-Eye, which was Aark. The nickname Plug-Eye came as a result of Aark having only a single eye, with the other being replaced by a crystal jammed into the socket. News of Ben's heroism from the other day had spread around the Claim by the daughter of Annalene, making everyone curious about the new visitor. Even though he had attempted to keep a low profile, he was already building a reputation. A problem that increased when it was revealed that the adult children of Oren Galt happened to be the same hooligans that caused the issue in Anchorhead and its bar. They didn't immediately recognize Obi-Wan from the other day, but they tried something again here, but with a clever and a discreet use of the Force. Ben ends the confrontation with a similar result, two of them injured and Kenobi fleeing back into the desert. Later, Annalene goes to visit Ben at his home, both to bring him the groceries he left behind and to try to learn more about him. Although he was guarded in their interaction, she was able to tell that he had something to hide. Not to mention, she could also pick up on his profound sadness. All of this made her even more curious. The whole time, both she and Kenobi were being watched by Aark, who was attempting to gain information about the settlers and their magic. During Aark's spying, she notices that Annalene was kind with a lost bantha calf that had been terrorizing Ben's home. In the Tusken Raiders culture, the desert itself has a spirit which connects all living creatures within it. Being kind to these creatures is the same as showing respect to the desert, which is a big deal for the Tuskens. Aark convenes a war council, who all decide to attempt to induct Annalene into their tribe. They believe that she is what is known as an air shaper, which is the Tusken term for a Force wielder. A few days pass, and Ben Kenobi was visiting the Claim, socializing with Annalene when the Tuskens led a raid. Led by Aark, the Sand People were there to kill everyone in sight and to take the one they called the Air Shaper. Their first target was to smash the speaker that played Oren's alarm. Heretofore, the Krayt Dragon roar on the speakers always spooked the other Tuskens. Aark was much smarter though than the average Tusken Raider, and much less superstitious. She knew it was a hoax, but had failed to get her brethren to understand. But now she was ready to take out the alarm once and for all. A firefight broke out, and Obi-Wan was unable to do anything besides keep a few of the settlers safe. He couldn't just whip out his lightsaber in sight of everyone, and so he devised a clever plan on the spot. Taking a fire extinguisher into the claim, he spread the flame-suppressant chemicals around so that the cloud blocked the vision from witnesses, as well as cameras. Only then did he activate his lightsaber and cut down the dozen or so attackers that filled the shop. Once the clouds dissipated, Ben passed off the credit to the kills to a nearby drunk farmer with a repeating blaster. Aark entered the store with more Tuskens, however, preparing to take Analeen, but she managed to get the activator remote for the alarm. The fake sound of the Krayt Dragons' roar spooked all of the Sand People, and despite Aark attempting to convince them all that it was a hoax, all of the Tusken warriors fled. Oren Galt, however, was enraged that they had attacked the claim, which was supposed to be a safe zone, and so he rallied the posse together, including Annaleen's young son Jabe, to go after them. Kenobi and Analeen took a speeder after them as well once they realized that her son was among them. However, upon their arrival, they witnessed Oren and his posse ambush the Tuskens in a gorge. It was a massacre on a huge scale. Despite Analeen having lost her husband to the Tuskens, she was sickened by the one-sided genocide. One of the very young Tuskens had survived, and then attempted to attack the two of them, but was taken out by a long-range blaster shot. It was at that moment that Aark and 7 surviving Tuskens encountered Kenobi and Analeen. Believing diplomacy was the best course of action, Ben presented Aark with the young Tusken's Gaddafi stick, a peace offering, and then gave her his body. The young Tusken had been her son. With a howl of anguish, Aark charged them both, but beneath Obi-Wan's cloak, the shiny metallic hilt of his lightsaber made her stop. Recognizing the weapon, she pointed at it and said, "Shiraad Het." Obi-Wan was dumbfounded. Not only was a Tusken Raider speaking Basic, but she knew Shiraad Het. This had been a legendary Jedi Master who had gone to live with the Sand People in a time prior to the Clone Wars. As it turns out, Aark and her clan were what was left of Shiraad Het's tribe following their war with the Hutts 13 years earlier. In fact, Aark herself was the adopted sister of the human woman taken into their tribe by the name of Kashyyyk, who became Shiraad's wife. This is how she could speak Basic, and how she recognized both Kenobi's lightsaber and Force abilities. She had seen the same tools used by Shiraad when he was their great war leader, who had once united many Tusken clans under a single tribe. Ben Kenobi and Aark conversed in Basic, allowing the Jedi to defuse the situation. Aark soon came to realize that Analeen was not the Airshaper at all. It had been Kenobi all along, and they all parted ways peacefully, and later, Aark contemplated what she had learned. The massacre had left her tribe largely without any warriors at all. This was a fatal wound to the clan which threatened their entire existence. They needed yet another great leader with mystical abilities like Shiraad. In her view, only Obi-Wan Kenobi could become the new Shiraad Het. However, she knew he wouldn't join them willingly, so she set out to find the one thing that she could use as leverage to compel him to become their leader. After the whole event, Analeen became bent on learning more about Ben, but despite their many conversations, he managed to dodge and evade every one of her probing questions. Despite not knowing hardly anything about him, she found him incredibly fascinating. At first because of his mysteriousness, he was unlike any of the other strangers she had ever met on Tatooine. He was kind, gentle, helpful, unwilling to speak about himself, and always carrying an aura of sadness. But after the event with the Tuskens, she was unable to get her mind off of him, and was even developing feelings towards the Jedi. However, that night, Annaleen's daughter, who was similarly infatuated with Kenobi, had snuck off to the hut. There she overheard him speaking aloud to Qui-Gon. Ben was recalling the day's adventures, the problems with the Sand People, how disturbed he was by Oren Galt's massacre, and some of his thoughts about Analeen. He disliked that he kept finding himself in situations every time he left his homestead, but there were just things that he could not ignore. Annaleen's daughter listened to everything, finally learning his surname when he spoke it aloud, Kenobi, the name that Analeen had been trying and failing to acquire. That next morning, the girl told her mother everything she had heard, and then the news spread. Soon everyone in the claim knew the name Kenobi, the name Obi-Wan had gone through great pains to keep hidden. During Obi-Wan's visit, Oren continues trying to sell Kenobi on his settler's call alarm, which everyone paid a subscription fee in order to use for protection. Kenobi at first believes it could be a useful way to keep tabs on the Lars, but ultimately refuses, not trusting Oren all that much after the massacre. Following this, Kenobi leaves the claim with the intention to never return. He was feeling himself becoming far too engrossed in the people's lives there. Although he hadn't been around very much, he felt that he could have a place among them, and unfortunately, that was not something he could allow himself to have. All of his visits had only resulted in chaos, and he felt he was now officially jeopardizing his mission. For a while, he found it cathartic to get invested in the lives of the people of the Pika Oasis. In his meditations to Qui-Gon, he mentioned how they cared just as much about their petty little dramas as the Jedi did the galaxy-altering events. In his adventures as a Jedi, the small concerns of everyday people had always flown beneath his notice. But here on Tatooine, Obi-Wan Kenobi was finally learning the lesson Qui-Gon had always tried to teach him, the way of tuning into the lives around him through the living force. This ran in contrast to Master Yoda's insistence on always keeping the bigger picture in mind. There was now a tug-of-war between Qui-Gon's teachings of remaining in the present, and Yoda's teachings of being mindful of the grand plan. Obi-Wan admitted that his time with the settlers had been enlightening, but for his safety and for the safety of the mission, he had to end it. Several weeks passed, and Kenobi was making good on his intentions, but by chance, he ended up running into Anakin and her children again while they were on their way to Mos Eisley. Despite Ben's protests, they insisted he come with them. He was unable to refuse because he was trying to get a cooling unit repaired, a service that could only be found at a major settlement. While at Mos Eisley, Kenobi found himself dodging Imperial stormtroopers, Anakin's prying questions, and even the Lars family. It was in this process of avoiding the latter that Kenobi and Anakin happened across Oren Galt and him fraternizing with gangsters. Ben told Anakin to get her and her children out while he snuck into their meeting to see what he could find out. What he found was that Oren Galt owed money to Jabba the Hutt, and with the instatement of a new empire, Jabba was needing some cash on hand just in case he needed to make some bribes. For this reason, he was demanding expedited payment from all accounts. They gave him 24 hours to make good on his debt. But because Oren was light on his last few payments, the gangsters were about to punish him. Before anything could happen though, Obi-Wan came to the rescue and helped Oren escape. However, he made sure to do so in such a way that Oren could not see his identity. After this event, Oren, Ben, Anakin, and all of their respective families met up in the city center. Oren, frazzled from his harrowing experience, drops down and proposes to Anakin. She stalls on the answer, not feeling the same way towards him, but feeling pressured by her community. Later on, she drives Ben Kenobi and his cooling unit home, and it's there where she professes her feelings for him. However, Obi-Wan turns her away. His mission is still his top priority. He cannot have any sort of public life. Doing that would only further endanger Anakin and those near to her. The two then have a conversation about Ben's past, and he finally opens up just slightly. He divulges that something terrible had happened to someone near to him, and that while they did it to themselves, he could have stopped it from the beginning, and that he caused their ultimate end. His heartache was now fully breaking through, and he anguished about the many people that were paying for his failure. Anakin mentions that she only sees one person paying for it, encouraging him to forgive himself and to let go of his pain. Ultimately, Anakin parted his company with the full intention to wait until he was ready to reciprocate her feelings, not wanting to marry Oren. That night in his meditations to Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan considered what it meant for a Jedi to have a family. He recalled that the Jedi used to be able to have families in the ancient days of the Order, and that families were strong in the Force. He also recalled many Jedi in history who accomplished great things because of the ones supporting them. For Kenobi, the Jedi Order had always been his family. Every knight was his brother or sister. Every master was his mother or father. He even calls Yoda his strange little green uncle. But now he has no one. This attachment to the Order itself wasn't something that Obi-Wan was prepared to face, mostly because he didn't know it existed until now. It's ironic how both Yoda and Obi-Wan uphold the Jedi teachings of non-attachment while also harboring a deep connection to the Jedi Order itself. This was not lost on Obi-Wan either, and he contemplates what it means to be a Jedi without the Order. How was he supposed to exist now that he didn't have the Order to fall back on when times got tough? He reached out into the Force to find other Jedi, but felt the Force as barren as Tatooine was. He hadn't realized that he had once felt a humming presence, alive with the Force ability of his fellow Jedi. It had fed him, and he hadn't even known it. This opened his mind's eye to the possibility of fully integrating himself into a new community. Perhaps Anakin and the Claim could be that for him, but he was still resistant, fearing being wrapped into the present without giving regard to the future. However, Ben realized something that interrupted his meditations and sent him out of his hut. A nearby farm is being attacked by Tusken Raiders, but in reality, these Tuskens were Oren Galt, his children, Annaline's son Jabe, all of them in disguise. They were attempting to scare the last stubborn farmer into signing up for the Settlers' Call Alarm, which would help Oren get the money he needed to pay back Jabba. Obi-Wan arrives and once again saves the day, disarming each of the imposters and defeating them with his Jedi agility and clever use of the Force. Kenobi unmasks Oren and the two come face to face with one another. Now caught in his scheme, Oren and his children manage to escape. However, during their fight, Jabe was captured by a band of real Tuskens led by Aark. They were all surrounding the unconscious Jabe, with Aark ready to strike him dead. It was vengeance for her own son being taken. But Obi-Wan confronted them once again and attempted diplomacy. But two Sand People attacked Ben, prompting him to hurl them backward with the Force. After demonstrating his power, he took out his lightsaber and had a standoff with Aark. The two of them then had a long conversation where Kenobi repeatedly attempted to bargain for Jabe's life. It was there when Aark finally gave him the proposition: join them and become the new Shiraad Het. Lead them the way that he did as their war chief, and other Tuskens, those who also remembered Shiraad, would follow. That was the only trade that she would consider: Ben's service for Jabe's life. Obi-Wan was stunned by this offer and actually took a moment to consider it. It wasn't a possibility he had ever thought of, and he had to admit that it would definitely keep him hidden. However, he ultimately refused. It wasn't the Jedi way for him to become a Tusken. The two of them now seemed to be at an impasse. Aark wanted vengeance on the settlers by killing Jabe, and Obi-Wan was not going to let that happen, even if he had to kill them all. Then he stopped his advance, realizing something else. He talked more with the Tusken chief and found out that this wasn't the first time Oren had done this. He'd been dressing up as Tuskens with his children and had been attacking multiple farms so that they would subscribe to his alarm system. Even now, he was only trying to marry Annaline so that he could put her store, the claim, all of it up as collateral to get yet another loan. His time was running out, and he was going to be killed by gangsters in a matter of hours if he didn't get the money. With all of the scheming clicking into place, Kenobi extinguishes his lightsaber. Now realizing that Aark's tribe had actually been wronged, they were being attacked for the raids that they did not do. With Oren revealed as the true villain, Obi-Wan decided to actually team up with Aark and gave her a plan of his own. Ben took Jabe home to his mother and sister, and along the way, Jabe told him everything about Oren's plans and actions. Kenobi had Jabe give a message to Oren: turn back now. However, Oren was now desperate and crazed. Kenobi was the only witness to his crime, and Oren intended to silence him so that it would never get out. His madness had now been exposed to Annaline and her family when he came to her in the night, begging and threatening her for her store's money. Later, Ben came to Annaline in her bedroom, and they discussed the full story of what was happening with Oren. As it turned out, he had invested heavily in fancy evaporators that didn't produce the water crop that he had been hoping. Oren owed the bank too much money, and he accidentally took a loan from a man who worked for Jabba the Hutt, and found himself in debt to the gangster. He then began embezzling money from the fund for the Settlers' Call Alarm, but around 3 years prior to the current date, something happened with the Lars. Something that scared the Tusken Raiders out of raiding the Settlers for quite some time. And although Obi-Wan didn't know it yet, this event was Anakin's massacre of the Sand People following the death of his mother. The news of this clan being totally and indiscriminately wiped out in a single night scared the other Tusken tribes, and the raid slowed down to a halt. Soon enough, subscriptions to the Call Alarm slowed down as well, as did weapon sales. Oren needed that money, and since the Call subscription relied on fear, he determined to create more of it. And so he had been using the clothes from the Sand People he had killed to stage attacks on people's homes, getting them to sign up for the system. Oren needed a cycle of violence in order to profit. Obi-Wan adds here that he has seen this before. Palpatine had also staged an entire war for his own benefit and profit, and Kenobi had spent the last few months mulling over everything that had happened. With all of it fresh in his mind, he was able to pick out Oren's scheme within a matter of hours. Oren Galt was no Palpatine. Ben was ready to do whatever it took to end Oren's madness. He had to stop a friend before, and it was time to do it again. Oren was rallying the allies to his scheme, to silence Kenobi. But now Ben had some allies of his own. He instructed Annaline and her children to pack their belongings and to leave the claim. Unfortunately, the store was going to be collateral damage now that it was about to be exposed. The claim had also profited greatly from the Settlers' Call with weapon sales. So even if they were ignorant of Oren's schemes, their reputation would be destroyed. Anakin trusted Kenobi and took his word to heart. Secretly, she had wanted a different life for herself and her children all along. The entire reason Jabe had joined Oren's ruse was because he hated the store and wanted something different with his life. It now looked like their opportunity to start a new life had now arrived, whether they were ready for it or not. But in his meditations with Qui-Gon, Obi-Wan mentioned something that shook him. Anakin had said, "There is still good in him," about Oren. This of course reminded him of Padme's last words concerning Anakin, but there were still other pressing matters on his mind. He keeps failing at being a hermit. In his words, Obi-Wan keeps taking charge of Ben Kenobi's life. But the Obi-Wan part of him wants to help someone and to do the right thing, to be a Jedi. He now wondered how to reconcile his responsibilities with who he truly was. How could Ben exist if Obi-Wan won't let him? But morning was coming soon, and so was the showdown. Oren sounded the alarm and called the posse together, announcing that Ben Kenobi was a traitor and had been selling them out to the Tuskens. The group then rode together to find the hermit in the Jundland Wastes. But Ben Kenobi was waiting for them and lured them into a trap at the rocky crags of the desert. Using his own force-powered mimicry of the Krayt Dragon roar, Ben caused a stampede of banthas that tore through the posse's speeders and disrupted their ranks. In the confusion, he stole Oren's loudspeaker and hid amongst the rocks with the Tuskens. There he shouted out all of Oren's crimes for the settlers to hear. But at that moment, something unexpected happened. Jabba's thugs arrived as well, ready to collect. Wanting to help, Anakin had contacted them and told them where Oren could be found. While hiding amongst the rocks, Ben and Aark began conversing about the plan. The Tuskens had too few warriors and could not take on either the settlers or the thugs. She was having to trust entirely on Ben's plan and his powers. It was there where she divulged more about the slaughter of the noble warrior tribe years earlier. How the death had come from a predator on two legs. Obi-Wan, filled with horror, began to piece things together. He had been told by Padme what happened to Shmi Skywalker, but not anything after that. And he began to suspect the truth, that the pride, the confidence of the Tusken people were not the only casualty of that horrid night. Anakin's actions had caused permanent, irreparable damage to Tatooine as a whole. The Sand People affected many things, and his slaughter of a mighty tribe caused a domino effect which was landing Obi-Wan, Anakin, Aark, and her tribe, as well as the entire town of Pika Oasis in the exact same situation. But right now, he could not get caught up in all of that. It was something he would need to investigate later. At the moment, he had to make good on his promise, and to help hide the Sand People. Below in the valley, all of Oren's sins were catching up to him. Anakin had arrived, and she attested to Ben's innocence to the settlers. Now everyone was ready to tear Oren apart. But a firefight broke out between the settlers and Jabba's thugs, with them fighting over who got to him first. Oren and his children instead took Anakin hostage with them and fled deeper into the rocky crags where Obi-Wan had disappeared. By now, Ben had helped Aark hide her people in the caves near their village. But as the Gults and Anakin arrived, Ben had to figure out what to do. He couldn't simply brandish his lightsaber, both for the sake of his secrecy as a Jedi and for the woman's safety. They had blasters to her head, so instead, Kenobi drew Oren into a maze of stone pillars with his voice. Within that, Obi-Wan toppled one of the pillars onto Oren with the Force, breaking his leg and disarming him of his blasters. Meanwhile, Aark ambushed the Galt children and saved Anakin by brutally murdering Oren's son. But all of the fighting stopped when the groundquake erupted, and yet another roar was heard. Only this time, it was not a recording, nor was it Obi-Wan's Force-imbued trickery. All of the gunfighting and noise had awoken a real Krayt Dragon, one that burst forth from the ground, ready to kill. There were no more tricks to hide behind. No amount of misdirection could solve this problem. Only Jedi action regardless of witnesses or consequences. In front of Oren, Obi-Wan brandished his lightsaber and wielded the Force. The knight fought the dragon there in the desert, using a spectacular display of Jedi abilities and agility, and after a loud and a destructive duel, Kenobi's saber struck true and smote the Krayt. Oren was terrified as he realized what Ben was. He had heard about the Empire and the purge from the news of the Hollows, and now he planned to go to the Empire about Obi-Wan and secure himself a better, superior life. As Oren raced for the speeder, Kenobi made no move to stop him, because he had already foreseen the man's fate. The madman attempted to ram Aark on his way out, but damaged the speeder and lost control, sending him tumbling to his death down into the canyon. With it all said and done, Obi-Wan Kenobi met back up with Anakin and had one final word with Aark. The Tusken chief stated that their deal was concluded, that they would now part ways, but she kept open the offer for Obi-Wan to join them if he ever changed his mind. Later on, Anakin and her children arrived with their packed things at Ben's hut. There, he gave them a surprise. He's booked them a flight off Tatooine, and even though he had once feared sending transmissions, he used his connections to Bail Organa to get Anakin and her daughter accepted at the Alderaanian University. Obi-Wan had found out that 20 years prior, Anakin had made an application to the university but never sent it in because of issues in her family. Therefore, she was kept on Tatooine, but now she was able to finally go live her dream, and her kids would have better opportunities off-world. Everything seemed too perfect, until she found out that Ben was not coming with them. She begged and begged him to reconsider, as he would slot perfectly into their family. Kenobi had an opportunity to have a life and a family of his own. But it wasn't to be. His duty came first, and he already had a child to watch over, Luke Skywalker. Heartbroken, Anakin left with her children, and Obi-Wan watched his chance at a potentially much happier life speed off beneath the star-laden sky. As an epilogue to this chapter, it turns out that Oren Galt had not died in this crash, but he was found by Aark. Forced to wear Tusken clothing, they made him one of them and compelled him to repair a vaporator that they had stolen. The Tuskens originally thought the settlers' vaporators were profane, stealing water out of Tatooine's air. But again, Aark was not as superstitious as the others. Having a working vaporator supplied their tribe with water, making them stronger and healthier. Oren was constantly under guard, and was only fed if he kept the vaporator running. He was now forced to be a part of the people he hated so much. Aark would also inform all other Tusken clans to stay away from Kenobi's hut. Many of the Sand People had witnessed him slay the Krayt Dragon that day, and she knew that there was no value in provoking the wizard. The twin suns would set, and the twin suns would rise, reminding all that time goes on. The only person that Obi-Wan really interacted with was now gone, and he had no desire to return to Pika Oasis. Though he had done good for the people there, they still believed that he was a very strange character, and none of them were eager to ever see him again. And so once again, his world fell silent except for the whispers of his past regrets. Kenobi may have stopped the bleeding, but his wounds were still fresh. Despite all that had occurred, these were only the first few weeks into the rest of his life. The exile of Obi-Wan Kenobi had only just begun. Chapter 2: The Ghost of Tatooine. Both sleep deprivation and the blistering heat of the desert have something in common. They make one see things that are not really there. For Ben Kenobi, who was suffering from both, his hallucinations conjured the dead. If only Qui-Gon would speak to him and confirm that he was not crazy. But the Master's ghostly voice remained silent, giving way to the voices of grief that consumed Obi-Wan's mind. Anakin was dead. This was something that Kenobi was certain of, and yet, in the Force, he could almost still feel his Padawan's presence. More and more, he mulled over the things he should have said in place of what had been said, and this caused Anakin to have a very real presence in his mind, despite not being there at all. Obi-Wan was engaged with him so intensely that he expected his friend to walk over the sand dunes and grin at him again, or scowl. It didn't matter which. He would take anything just to see Anakin again. Obi-Wan continued to violate every principle of the Jedi about remaining in the present and accepting what was. Rather, he searched and searched his memories for the key that could have unlocked Anakin's heart. He needed to know when and why his Padawan had turned to the dark side of the Force. He wrestled with accepting the Anakin that he had loved had been the one that had turned. It was an impossibility to him. He suspected that something within his friend had twisted him in some way, and Palpatine had somehow exploited it. At this point in time, Ben had slipped into a deep depression. Following the departure of Anakin, he had spent the next several months in misery. Even getting from place to place felt like a chore. The constantly shifting sand beneath his feet caused the very ground he walked on to fight his progress. Very appropriate for what was going on in his mind. Kenobi remembered how much Anakin hated sand, and now he too shared that sentiment. But in a way, he was grateful for the sand. An excerpt from the short story Last One Standing says this: Obi-Wan didn't like the sand either, but he was grateful for the absence of color. He didn't find the planet beautiful, and so at least he felt no loss when he traveled across the landscape. Once he had loved the vivid greens of forests, the deep blues of lakes and seas. Now everything blended into everything else. Mesa, cliff, hill, road. There was no vegetation to refresh the eye, no sudden explosion of flowers to startle you into a fresh appreciation of the living. He didn't want to appreciate anything. He wanted a place of no color, flat, light, dark, shadow. It suited him now. During this period of time, he spent every dawn and every dusk crossing the lands to watch over the Lars homestead. He'd do a perimeter patrol while trying to stay out of sight. He didn't take any chances with the Tusken Raiders, and despite his success with Aark's tribe, not every one of them were so willing to negotiate. They were beings that stole what they needed to survive and took pleasure in brutality. But on one particular morning at the Lars, Ben would notice that all of Owen's vaporators had been stolen by the Sand People. They needed the water collecting machines since they were the main source of both survival and income. Not bothering to hide anymore, Ben approached Owen, offering to retrieve the stolen vaporators. Owen refused though, stating that he could take care of his own and he planned to rally the other farmers to go after them. But Ben knew what had happened to his father, Klieg Lars, when him and a group went after the Sand People years earlier. Too many of them died, and Klieg lost his leg. Beru was terrified of the same or worse happening to Owen. Ben of course sensed this fear and foreboding. And so despite his vow not to interfere, Ben went after the Sand People anyway. Obi-Wan tracked the Sand People back to their camp, and during his journey, his mind was thrown to the past. He remembered Qui-Gon's teachings and attempted to imagine what his master would say to him now. The spiritual voice of the Jedi remained silent though, so Kenobi had to conjure his master's old words from memory. Along with this, Obi-Wan remembered that Anakin had once done exactly what he was doing now, trying to find the Tusken Raiders. However, he didn't know what else had happened after Anakin's mother had died in his arms. All he recalled was that after that day, a shadow enveloped his friend that Obi-Wan could never penetrate. He had tried to talk to Anakin about it, but his Padawan had brushed off his questions and confided in Padme instead. Obi-Wan realized now that they had married in secret, which was a part of the reason he felt a divide between himself and Anakin for so long. Ben began to think that, had Anakin told him of the marriage, he would have understood. Not approved, of course, but at least understood. After all, he had loved before too. First there was Siri Tachi, and then there was Satine Kryze. Obi-Wan blamed himself for Anakin not feeling like he could come to him about this information. He believed that had he been more like Qui-Gon, Anakin would not hate him. His mind once again took him back to Mustafar, and the 3 words that Anakin roared at him as he writhed in pain: "I hate you." He could talk about Palpatine's manipulations all day long, but from Obi-Wan's perspective, he was the target of Anakin's fury. The student ended up hating his master, and to Obi-Wan, that was the master failing. By the time he got back to the Tusken camp, it was nightfall. The Tuskens were cooking their meals and retiring to their individual family tents. Kenobi clung to the shadows and crept across their camp to find where the vaporators were kept. In movements identical to Anakin's own infiltration, Kenobi cut a hole into one of the tents with his lightsaber. Within were all of the loot from the Sand People's recent raids, including Owen's stolen vaporators. Obi-Wan began very quietly loading them onto a bantha, which he intended to steal himself. However, he was discovered. A Tusken Raider swung at him and let out a war cry. Soon Obi-Wan found himself surrounded by Sand People warriors, all ready to enjoy their late-night kill. Earlier dealings with the Tuskens informed him all about their culture, and although he had been able to have diplomacy navigate his last encounter, this group was not so negotiable. This was not Aark's tribe, and they neither spoke Basic nor had any understanding of the weapon that Obi-Wan wielded. The Jedi nimbly avoided their initial strikes and cut up some of their Gaddafi sticks, but as they all rushed him at once, Kenobi felt something that he had not felt in a very long time, at least not this strongly. He looked at their inhuman masks, which were made to cover up every inch of skin and look intentionally terrifying. They were a people that made nothing and gave nothing. They preyed on the weak and stole everything. They took from honest, hardworking farmers and had tortured Shmi Skywalker for a month just to test her resolve. These were beings with so much darkness inside that life meant nothing to them. They were just like the Sith. The Sith, which had taken over the galaxy, had stripped Obi-Wan of everything that he loved. The Jedi Order, his family, it was gone. The Republic, his vocation, they hated him now, and was now something unrecognizable. And his friend, his closest friend, twisted by evil, forcing Obi-Wan to destroy him. It was all too much. Every sleepless, tear-filled night, every nightmare when he got a single wink of rest, every conversation he replayed over and over again in his mind to the point of torture. It all finally snapped. A shadow of loathing fell over him, a fearsome anger not even like when Qui-Gon Jinn had died in front of him on Naboo. Obi-Wan changed his stance. No longer on the defensive, the mindful Sarisu, but now in an aggressive pose with his lightsaber held high, a position taught to him by Anakin. He would avenge his brother, give him some kind of vengeance against these people who had wronged him. He knew he could destroy every being in this camp with ease. He felt his fury rising and he took pleasure in it. It was obliterating everything else within him. But what's more is that Obi-Wan wanted to be overtaken. He didn't want to be careful. He didn't want to have restraint. He wanted only the heat of satisfaction. The dark side called, and Kenobi was preparing to answer. But then, Qui-Gon Jinn's voice made his mind go static. "Don't become your enemy, Obi-Wan." The voice was not yet the spirit of Qui-Gon Jinn, but a memory of his teachings. But Obi-Wan believed that it was Qui-Gon Jinn's ghost pushing that memory to the forefront of his mind. The presence of it was too strong, and Obi-Wan realized what was happening within him. At last, he turned away from anger and remembered that Qui-Gon never took a life if there was an alternate way to stop it. And the alternative that Obi-Wan recognized was the Sand People themselves. As Qui-Gon had once said, if you know their weakness, you can defeat your enemy. And the Sand People's weakness was their staunch culture and their superstition. They believed that showing any amount of skin was weak and shameful. There was no greater disgrace than to have one's face be seen by anyone but immediate family. If flesh were exposed in any capacity, that meant either banishment or death according to their law and customs. Knowing this gave Kenobi power over the situation, and he leapt over his attackers. His new target was a tent behind him. With quick slashes of his lightsaber, he destroyed several tents and exposed what was within. Tusken females with their faces and their hands exposed. The children in the tents were also exposed, as they had been eating their evening meal. With shrieks of terror, they attempted to cover their children and bury their heads in the sand. The warrior men were stunned by the sight, enabling Kenobi to start cutting away their clothes and at their masks. Obi-Wan even exposed their skin and faces, causing them all to screech and to flee. Their customs of shame completely overrode their bloodthirst, and they were now running to cover their families to protect them from disgrace. Obi-Wan Kenobi stood triumphant, not only over his enemies, but the dark side of the Force itself. Having dealt with the Tuskens the Jedi way, Kenobi hopped on the Bantha and rode off with the Vaporators. He returned the machines to Owen, who gave him a terse and a cold thank you. Beru was much more thankful than her husband was that he had not been going out there to face the Tuskens alone. But Obi-Wan didn't care very much about what Owen thought. He was just happy that Luke wasn't going to have to grow up without a father. Afterwards he left and went on his way once again. This had been the closest brush with the dark side that Obi-Wan ever had in his entire life. There had been plenty of moments, especially when he faced Maul, but nothing came close to this, because in that moment it wasn't just about losing Qui-Gon, it had been the cumulative agony of his entire exile and the reason behind it. In that moment, Kenobi was almost no more, given over to his fury and the unfairness of it all. But because he was a Jedi, the Jedi, he protected what remained and kept himself from being destroyed. In that moment, he looked the dark side in the eyes and repeated what he had once told Maul. "You can kill me, but you will never destroy me. It takes strength to resist the dark side. Only the weak embrace it." Months passed, and Obi-Wan found himself at Tashi Station in Anchorhead. It was one of the only places around that had a HoloNet news projector and good water. But the reason he was there was because he was keeping a distant eye on Lars, who were buying some of the things that they needed in the city. But while he was there having a drink, he overheard the news report speaking of a Jedi uprising on a world that he was familiar with, Kashyyyk. The HoloNet reported that they had all been killed. The news felt like ice on Obi-Wan's soul. He and Yoda had recalibrated the temple beacon to warn all Jedi to go into deep hiding. And yet these foolish Jedi thought that they could band together and take on Palpatine. Obi-Wan knew that they hadn't yet realized Palpatine was the one who manipulated the entire Clone Wars, that he was a Sith and occupied the throne of the Empire. In Obi-Wan's new opinion, they had all been played from the beginning, and the Republic had never been worth fighting for. But upon looking back up at the garbled signal of the HoloNet feed, Obi-Wan caught the image of a figure dressed from head to toe in black armor. Apparently, this Imperial had been responsible for putting down the Jedi insurrection and enslaved the Wookiee population on Kashyyyk. And then, that is when he heard the name, Lord Vader. Time stopped, In a daze, Obi-Wan stood straight up, knocking over his table, and then felt his legs go out from under him. After months of agonizing grief, he had at least thought most of the problems were taken care of. But now, a realization wrecked his entire world like a starship crash. Vader was alive. One of the other bar patrons noticed Kenobi's condition and helped him out by buying him a drink and making sure that he was okay. The man was a dock worker and had heard that from a friend that Vader was terrible news. He informed Kenobi to keep his mouth shut about Vader because the man was seen crossing sabers with Jedi, tearing Wookiees apart like they were stuffed toys. He gave Ben one final word of caution. These desert wastes aren't as remote as you may think they are. And with that, Ben staggers out of Tosche Station, barely able to see straight. His mind ran with every thought possible. He was foolish for bringing Luke to Tatooine, the place of Anakin's relatives. He had driven Anakin deeper in the dark side by abandoning him on Mustafar. Could he ever face Anakin again? Could he actually kill him this time? Should he warn Owen and Beru? Should Obi-Wan take Luke far away from them, hide him on an even more remote world? His fear began to mount. His and Yoda's hopes for the future seemed dashed, just as the Chosen One had dashed the Jedi's hopes of bringing balance to the Force. Obi-Wan. His mind stopped reeling as his name was spoken into his mind, but not by his own thoughts, by the spectral voice of Master Qui-Gon Jinn. At last the voice from beyond spoke. This was the first time that Ben had heard it since being on Tatooine. The very first time it wasn't a memory or a hallucination. Realizing who it was, Obi-Wan ducked into an alleyway and excitedly responded. He asked his master if Darth Vader was indeed Anakin, and Qui-Gon told him yes, though the Anakin that he and Obi-Wan knew was imprisoned by the dark side now. Obi-Wan finally exhaled his grief. He stated that he should have never left Anakin there. He should have made sure that he was dead. But Qui-Gon simply told him that the Force will determine Anakin's future. He instructed Obi-Wan not to tell Luke about Vader until the time was right. Ben wondered if he should take extra measures to hide Luke, but Qui-Gon explained why the Dark Lord would never come to Tatooine. The core of Anakin that resides within him knows that Tatooine is the source of everything that causes him pain. Vader will never set foot on Tatooine if only out of fear of awakening Anakin. With Ben's anxieties now dissipating, he recognized that his obligation remained unchanged, but even more vigilant and important. He followed Owen and Beru for the rest of the day, just to make sure that they were safe. But while Kenobi was there, he visited a junk shop and found something that he had not seen in years, an ancient leather-bound book. Typically, information was recorded on data tapes or something of the like, but Kenobi realized that keeping a journal would be an excellent way to preserve knowledge of the Jedi, information that Luke would need someday. All of the pages were blank, ready to be used. To any other being in the galaxy, it was a relic of a bygone era, barely good for kindling. But for Ben Kenobi, it would become far more valuable than any holocron. Finally being able to speak with Qui-Gon came as a saving grace to Kenobi's sanity. Before he was simply speaking words into nothingness, but now he could have a full-on conversation with his old master. Over the next few months, Obi-Wan believed that he was ready to train in the way of the wills, the way of retaining one's identity after their death. This had been the training that Yoda had mentioned back on Palis Massa. It was supposed to be the very thing that Obi-Wan should have been doing this entire time, and so he was ready to finally have something to do again. More training was better than nothing. However, Qui-Gon told him that he was not yet ready, and he had to learn why before he could begin teaching him how. Roughly a year had gone by since the beginning of Kenobi's exile, and Ben had fallen into his own new routine in life. But little did he know that the adventure would call to him yet again, and that Obi-Wan Kenobi would be a name that he would have to pick up for one last time. While sitting in a Mos Eisley cantina, Obi-Wan overhears another rumor pertaining to the Jedi. Ferus Olin had survived Order 66, and was now a wanted fugitive stirring up trouble on his home planet of Balassa. Ferus Olin had been a former Jedi Padawan that Kenobi knew long ago when Anakin himself was young. He had believed the boy to be dead for a while now, so this revelation seemed to tear Obi-Wan in twain. On one hand, his sworn duty kept him bound to Tatooine. He couldn't simply leave Luke behind unguarded. On the other hand, the idea that any Jedi survived the Purge gave Obi-Wan a spark of hope for the future of the Order. He felt compelled to go to help Ferus, but how could he justify leaving Luke even for just a moment? Torn between the two paths, Ben desperately sought guidance from Qui-Gon. The spirit of his master actually guides him to leaving Tatooine and to helping the young Jedi. It was the will of the Force that the news had come to Obi-Wan, and this mission would help him in his internal journey. Qui-Gon even promised that he would watch over Luke in his absence. With this reassurance, Obi-Wan Kenobi was freed to go on one final mission as a Jedi. Even though his trauma and torment in the desert had destroyed his sense of self, there was one thing that remained: his enduring selflessness and his inability to turn his back on those in need, even at great personal cost. This was why, even after everything, Obi-Wan Kenobi was still a Jedi Master. Kenobi secures passage to the planet of Balessa. This was the first time he had actually been out in the galaxy since he left Polis Massa. It was also the first time that he fully witnessed Imperial oppression. Tatooine was a lot more out of the way, so it took quite a while for the Empire to establish any sort of presence out there in the unknown. So although he had one or two run-ins with stormtroopers, Obi-Wan had not actually seen the effects of the new regime. Balessa is under harsh Imperial control, however, due to Ferus Olin's rebel activities on the planet. The people are suffering and terrified of the Star Destroyers that loom overhead. Kenobi bobs and weaves stormtroopers, trying to keep his face hidden from all of them, but he feels his soul aching the whole time. Every time he sees a trooper, it only reminds him of the once respected role that he served as a Jedi General, and now they all had the order to kill him on sight. During his scurrying through the streets, Obi-Wan encounters a young orphan by the name of Trevor, who he quickly grows attached to. He had been wanting to nurture and train an apprentice for a long time, and had thought that he could do that with Luke, but it just didn't work out that way. So for now, Trevor would fill that void in his heart, as he had always done with Anakin, desiring to train yet another apprentice, this time the right way. Soon enough though, Kenobi discovers that Ferus is working with a local resistance known as the 11, and with Trevor's help, he tracks down Olin. The reunion of the Jedi is one of a shock and tremendous relief. For the first time since departing Yoda's company, Kenobi actually gets to be in the presence of another Jedi. Ferus, of course, was overjoyed to see a friendly face. Immediately, though, they're plunged into action when Obi-Wan helped Ferus rescue one of his rebel friends for the Empire. Back in the role of a Jedi, General Obi-Wan Kenobi took the spotlight within Obi-Wan's consciousness. Being back in action rekindled his sense of purpose. Not to mention actually doing something against the Empire instead of hiding was more than a cathartic experience. However, with each minor victory, Obi-Wan only comes to understand just how powerful the Empire really is. They were seemingly omnipotent, and he begins to see that defying them himself is futile. His place truly was on Tatooine, raising Luke to be the hope of a new future. But that didn't mean that he couldn't at least help out the other Jedi that still survived. Ferus Olin had long since ran away from the Jedi path, and was ready to return to the Creed. Obi-Wan once again stepped into the role of a master, helping Ferus retain himself in the ways of the Force. And throughout all of these events, Kenobi would frequently commune with Qui-Gon to seek his advice. However, Obi-Wan helping out Ferus put him back directly in the Empire's crosshairs. They hadn't discerned the identity of the second Jedi yet, and so they did not alert Lord Vader. Instead, they hired the elite bounty hunters to deal with them. Soon enough, the Jedi found themselves pursued by the up-and-coming Boba Fett, who was still on a path of vengeance against what Jedi remained. Along with him is a cyborg bounty hunter by the name of Daharin. Boba attacks the 11's hideout, prompting Kenobi to fight him saber on blaster. The exchange reminds him of how he had once battled Jango Fett, since the young Boba was quickly approaching his father's skill in combat. But despite being rusty with the lightsaber, Kenobi managed to finish off the fight by using his resourcefulness and forcing Boba to escape. When battling Fett, Kenobi experienced flashes of his old self during the Clone Wars. It was his instinct to slay the bounty hunter as a Jedi soldier in wartime would have. But Obi-Wan was not a soldier, he was a Jedi, and so he exercised restraint rather than killing the bounty hunter. Following the confrontation, he had the sobering realization that each and every time he ignited his lightsaber, he risked exposure as one of the last Jedi, an exposure which affected not only himself, but Ferus Olin, their rebel cause, and a young Luke. Ultimately, the Empire decided to do with Balessa what Thrawn did to Lothal. They held the population of a major city hostage, forcing Olin to turn himself in. Realizing that his people will never be safe so long as the Empire hunted them, Ferus made the sacrificial play to protect his home. In a dramatic bid to save the planet, Ferus Olin surrendered himself to Imperial forces, hoping the Empire would spare his people if they got their primary target. Obi-Wan was reluctant to allow him to do this, not wanting to see another Jedi be lost to Vader's purge. However, the Empire for the time kept their word. They captured Olin and pulled out of the planet. However, the Jedi had formulated a plan. Once the Empire got what they wanted and stopped holding the world hostage, Kenobi immediately helped his friend escape. The two of them fled from the Imperials, closely followed by Boba Fett. Obi-Wan was acutely aware that if he returned to Tatooine with Fett on his trail, that he could lead the Empire directly to Luke. This realization caused him palpable anxiety, since his current predicament was in direct conflict with his primary mission. Obi-Wan remained with Ferus Olin and Trevor, but he kept trying to find opportunities to part ways, but every time he did, he was delayed. And if a bounty hunter weren't enough, the events of Balessa caught the attention of the Grand Inquisitor. Malorum, who was the first Grand Inquisitor, was one of the only beings that knew Darth Vader's real identity, and he had been investigating the Polis Massa medical facility to learn what he could about Skywalker and his children. Kenobi learned about the Inquisitor following his trail, and so despite wanting to return to Tatooine, he delayed it so to throw Malorum off of the investigation. This meant returning to Polis Massa. Emotionally, this was yet another harrowing experience for Obi-Wan. It was the place where Padme breathed her last, where she spoke her heartbreaking final words. However, the duty of his mission trumped over the pain, and he crept through the halls of the medical facility. This time, his grief fueled his action rather than paralyzing him as it once had. With his resolve intact, he removed all the evidence of the twins' birth, and while there, he had a run-in with the Inquisitor by the name of Sancor, who had been there to meet a medical professional. Kenobi pretended to be that professional, but his disguise failed when Sancor saw a picture of what the professional was supposed to actually look like. He ran out with a crucial record disc and led Kenobi into a large, dimly lit medical theater. In the theater, Sancor fired his wrist rocket at the Jedi, but it missed and hit the operating platform Sancor was standing on. The platform collapsed, and Sancor fell off onto the table, covered with sharp medical instruments, dying an instant and a gruesome death. After destroying the crucial data of the Skywalker twins, Obi-Wan was able to ensure that neither Vader nor Malorum would become aware of them ever, at least not here. With that perilous errand resolved, another potential hope crossed Obi-Wan's path. He and Ferus received intelligence about yet another Jedi survivor. Ferus, of course, wanted to find him to have him join their mission against the Empire, but Obi-Wan just wanted to help any survivors of the Order that he could. Their search initially brought them to the war-torn world of A'Sharad, where the separatist-aligned populace had refused to accept that the Clone Wars had officially ended. They continued to fight against the newly arrived Imperial forces, but what brought Olin and Kenobi there was the possibility of it having the last stand of a Jedi team. For Obi-Wan, stepping onto this ravaged battlefield was like walking into a time capsule of the war that he had lived through, only now he saw it as a bystander rather than an active general. But that would change when he saw a local resistance group struggling against the Imperial oppression. Obi-Wan was unable to resist lending aid, once again becoming a general with no rank, but with pure moral integrity. The difference was that he found himself fighting alongside his former Clone Wars enemies now, against what had become the corrupted mutation of the Republic. Ferus Olin became inspired by Obi-Wan's leadership along the way, taking the lessons to heart for his own journey. Though they achieved victory on the world of A'Sharad, their search for Jedi turned up little in that world. Investigations instead led to the ice planet of Ilum, the home of the Kyber crystals, but these caves would yield much more than what the Jedi had bargained for. It was known that the caves of Ilum were exceptionally powerful in the Force, and would grant visions to those who entered as a means of testing them. The Jedi once described it as a place where nightmares become reality and dark warnings tell of conflicts yet to come. Ferus Olin confronted his own visions, and came out of the event with his own crystal to rebuild a brand new lightsaber. But Obi-Wan's trials would be much more intense. Obi-Wan was confronted with visions of his past, such as his old love Siri Tachi, nightmares of Anakin Skywalker becoming Darth Vader. Deep within the ice caves, Olin and Kenobi located the one that they were searching for, the Jedi Knight by the name of Garen Mulin, who happened to be an old friend of Obi-Wan's during their Padawan days. However, Garen was found comatose in critical condition. For a strange moment, Obi-Wan felt a sense of survivor's guilt, seeing the wounds inflicted on his friend by Order 66. But while he couldn't save Anakin from the dark side, he could at least save this Jedi from death. He and Ferus took Garen out of the caves. On the surface of Ilum, they were confronted with an Imperial company that had tracked them there. An explosive fight ensued, and the Jedi all made a narrow escape. On an asteroid base, Garen Mulin received medical attention and eventually awoke. Afterwards, he had a heart-to-heart with his old friend Kenobi. The two lament that even though they survived, they cannot rejoin or rebuild the Jedi as they once were. It was finished, stamped out by the Empire. All they could do now is hide and resist in secret, while trusting and believing only in the Force. But Ferus Olin had a different path in mind. While they can't rebuild the Order, they can always fight the Empire, and so Ferus Olin organized his own resistance movement. Using the asteroid as a base, he intended to create a safe haven for all surviving Jedi and all allies of them, a new community to protect those the Empire hunted. He offered Obi-Wan to join them, but the Jedi Master refused, knowing that his place was elsewhere. But seeing Olin step up into the role of leadership inspired hope within Kenobi. Though he must now bow out, there would always be those ready and willing to fight the evil that now ruled the galaxy. However, it was a moment of mixed emotions. He was both proud of Ferus, but melancholy that he himself could not take that path because of his duty to Luke. After having been out in the galaxy and done things to help, Obi-Wan realized that he wanted to fight the Empire, but that he could not. This was his time to pass the torch to the next generation. In this moment, he transcended his grief and aimlessness, reaching a place of acceptance and hope. Acceptance that his time was over, but that he must remain in the shadows, but that hope in others, like Ferus Olin, will carry the light of the Jedi. And all at once, Obi-Wan realized that this is what Qui-Gon had always wanted to teach him. With Boba Fett completely off their trail now, Kenobi returned to his primary mission. Going back to Tatooine was difficult for Kenobi. He had to say goodbye to Ferus Olin, Trevor, and Garen, once again returning to a life of solitude and of silence. Just like with Annalene, Obi-Wan sacrificed a life that he desperately wanted to live in order to protect the hope of the future. But again, he was left with acceptance and a cautious optimism for what his friends in the galaxy were now accomplishing, fighting against the Empire. And when Ben Kenobi resumed his daily life, it was not as a man nearly broken as he was before. He was a renewed man, still a Jedi. We now skip forward to the year 17 BBY. Obi-Wan has been in exile for nearly 2 years. During that time, he decided to continue practicing with his lightsaber. His recent quest had shown him the folly of allowing his skills to atrophy, so he made sure to practice more with his Jedi weapon, as he believed the time would one day come when he would need it. Little did Kenobi know that it would save his life very soon. Despite all of the actions to help the settlers against the Tuskens, there was a sudden increase in atrocities. 3 farms had been attacked in a single day. But what disturbed Obi-Wan the most was the unnerving disturbance in the Force that he sensed. He could feel a tangible trace of the dark side in the air. Concerned that it could be Sith, Kenobi decided to take a closer look, to keep a more watchful eye on Luke. Ben was on his way to see Luke when he pulled aside to examine the ruins of a Tusken camp. He had passed by this particular ruined camp many times, but subconsciously avoided it due to a dreadful feeling that came upon him whenever he traveled near it. This was the first time that he felt compelled to actually inspect the camp. This particular day that he was traveling by it, the feeling was almost sickening. The bantha he was riding refused to even go near it, forcing him to hop off and visit the ruins himself. When Ben was inspecting one of the empty tents, he noticed it was a Tusken torture tent, and all at once, the Force endowed him insight into where he was standing. This is where Anakin's mother had died. The realization shocked him, yet the horrors of this discovery were only the beginning. Tearing his eyes away from the torture hut, he found bones poking up through the sand. The entire area was littered with the skeletons of sand people of all sizes. Ben remembered what Aark had said to him about a camp of warriors being suddenly wiped out overnight. It was an investigation that he had nearly forgotten about due to his recent adventures, but now he found himself facing the truth. It was Anakin. It had always been Anakin. The secret that his Padawan hid all those years. The reason that Obi-Wan couldn't get his apprentice to look him in the eyes after coming back from Tatooine. The part of the story that Padme left out. The birth of Darth Vader. Just then, Qui-Gon's voice came to him and said, "Now you know." Obi-Wan asked Qui-Gon why he didn't tell him the truth, to which the disembodied master replied that Kenobi was not ready. Obi-Wan was distressed by the discovery, and wondered why Qui-Gon maintained that Anakin was still the Chosen One if he had committed genocide and kept it a secret from the Jedi Order and the rest of the galaxy. Master Qui-Gon mentioned that he hadn't kept it from everyone, and from that comment, Kenobi understood that of course Padme and Palpatine would have known, and that Owen Lars likely had figured it out as well. This gave Obi-Wan a deeper understanding of Owen. If the farmer had the impression that the Jedi are prone to murder in the same act of revenge, this explained his caution of Kenobi. Qui-Gon then asked his apprentice why Anakin had kept it a secret from him. Obi-Wan was about to reply, because he was afraid he'd be banished from the Jedi, but instead, he thought for a moment and said, it didn't matter who Anakin told. What mattered is that he was a Jedi and he had become a butcher. Qui-Gon warned Obi-Wan not to judge when he fails to understand, and at this, Kenobi got exacerbated and demanded to know exactly what he was supposed to understand about all of it. But Qui-Gon cryptically responds that it was as he said. Obi-Wan was not ready. The Jedi Master sighs in frustration at the specter, and turns to leave while telling Qui-Gon that when he is ready, he hopes his master will let him know. But Qui-Gon stops him once more by saying, "For now, Obi-Wan, know this. Anakin revealed his secret to another, to A'Sharad Het." With this grave realization now in hand, Obi-Wan traveled quickly to the Lars homestead. There he pitched a tent and camped out for 3 days, remaining as close to Luke as possible. All the while he considered that A'Sharad may be the one doing the killings across the Dune Sea, and on the 3rd day, Owen met up with him. Rather than reprimand Ben for being on his land, for once Owen was actually thankful to see the Jedi. One farm that had been attacked more recently had all of its inhabitants wiped out save for one little girl. The girl described one of the Tuskens as brandishing laser swords. This all but confirmed Obi-Wan's suspicion about Het. Owen and Kenobi then discussed what Anakin had done 5 years earlier, revealing that Lars was still haunted by that dreadful day. In his words, Shmi Skywalker was a wonderful woman, but when Anakin brought Shmi's body home, I'll never forget the look in his face. If killing me would have brought his mother back to life, I know he would have killed me then and there. I could see it in his eyes. Obi-Wan remained at the Lars homestead for another day, until the Tuskens arrived on their banthas. As expected, they were led by A'Sharad Het. Kenobi recognized him instantly by the lightsabers on his belt. A'Sharad had returned to the life that he knew prior to becoming a Jedi, taking his place as their warrior leader, the place that his father had filled. Het strode up to him calmly, greeted him like an old friend. Kenobi then ascertained that he may not have known that Anakin had become Darth Vader, or that the son of Skywalker was in the house behind him. Had A'Sharad known that, Obi-Wan surmised that Luke would already have been dead. Het was glad to see that Obi-Wan had survived Order 66, and wondered what had brought him to Tatooine. Kenobi said that he did. Leading Tuskens as a warlord was not something that a Jedi ought to do. Het rebutted by saying, "Do not lecture me," the same words that Vader had once spoken. A'Sharad said that they had been generals in the Clone Wars, warlords for a republic that had turned on them. He then explains that the Tuskens' plight, that they were hunted and killed by the settlers. In his mind, the Jedi defend those who need help, sometimes by taking the life of the aggressor. However, Obi-Wan countered that the danger is what is becoming what you fight. He now saw that it was the trap of the Jedi Order itself, why they had failed. But A'Sharad said that his father was the greatest Jedi of the age, and yet raised him to think and act as a Tusken. Those were his people, and he would stop them from being butchered. Het declared that the settlers will be forced to abandon the sand or be buried beneath it. Seeing that negotiations were not to be, Ben Kenobi ignited his lightsaber and stated that he cannot permit that. A'Sharad's path of revenge ends here, igniting his own twin lightsabers. Het promised Kenobi that he will be given a Jedi's funeral. The duel began. The crackling of lightsabers echoed across the desert wasteland. The sand people on their banthas did not interfere, but simply watched the duel go down. This was their noble leader from the same house as Shiraad Het, battling the legendary wizard that had slain a Krayt Dragon. The 1v1 engagement was to be respected, and at that moment, Obi-Wan was thankful that he had kept up his training. He admitted to himself that had he not, then he would have been finished and finished quickly. Having said that, the fight was extremely difficult. Ben commended Het as a formidable warrior that required all of his skill. But not only that, A'Sharad was 10 years younger, and he was an expert in desert combat. Obi-Wan did not want to kill a fellow Jedi, and desperately wished that he could force Het to surrender, but he believed that this was not going to happen. But that's when it came to him. He wasn't fighting for his own sake, but for Luke. And with that in mind, he looked for alternatives. Just as he had done with the Tuskens long ago, he would use their weaknesses against them. A'Sharad's defenses were too good for Kenobi to strike him with his lightsaber, and so he summoned an immense amount of force energy and struck out in a tightly controlled blast right at A'Sharad's shoulder. The result was Het's arm being blown clean off of his body. In the same motion, Kenobi disarmed him of his other weapon, and then tore Het's mask right off of his face. In this way, Kenobi sealed his fate in 2 different ways. According to Tusken culture, those who cannot wield a Gaddafi stick with 2 hands cannot survive the desert and must be left behind. And of course, he was also dishonored by having his face exposed. The Tusken Raiders that had once followed him now quietly turned around and left him without a sound. On his knees, A'Sharad Het told Obi-Wan that he had been disgraced and that he was now a dead man. Kenobi may as well finish the job. But instead of murdering a fellow Jedi, Ben would leave his fate to the Force and to the desert. The Jedi Master hoped that A'Sharad would find the Jedi's way through meditation and to come back to the light. And with that, Het left, and Obi-Wan bid him goodbye, and may the Force be with him. Unfortunately, unbeknownst to Kenobi, he had just repeated his same mistake on Mustafar, not finishing one who was going down the dark path. Many decades in the future, A'Sharad Het would return, but not as a Tusken, but as Darth Krayt. This would actually not be the first time that the Lars home would come under threat by a Darksider from the past though. As we know in canon, Darth Maul would eventually find Obi-Wan Kenobi on Tatooine. There they had their final climactic duel. However, since we are not covering the canon continuity of Kenobi's exile, we will be excluding that story. Having said that, it doesn't mean that we have to exclude the story that the duel is based on. Darth Maul indeed returns with cybernetic legs, and he does eventually find his old rival on a sand planet. But this story happens in Star Wars Infinity's continuity, meaning that it's neither canon nor Legends, but technically non-canon. We'll let you decide whether you consider it a part of Legends or not, but we have decided to include it, and the story technically falls right here, on the 3rd year of Imperial occupation. Since returning, Darth Maul has been following Obi-Wan throughout the entire Clone Wars, having only been 2 steps behind him. But after gaining information from Paulus Massa and Watto the Junk Dealer, Maul found his way to the Lars homestead. He now knew that Anakin Skywalker had a son, and knew it was the place where he could find Kenobi. With his mechanical legs, Maul stormed across the desert like a predator until he found the Lars homestead. Owen had been showing a toddler Luke the sunset when he saw Maul charging across the sand dunes. He called for Beru to keep Luke safe, and then aimed to shoot Maul with his blaster rifle. However, the Sith summoned Owen's rifle right into his hand and broke the stock across his face. He was not there to play games. He was there for one reason, and he had made that reason known by shouting out into the desert for Kenobi to show himself. But Obi-Wan had known that Maul was coming. He had felt the Zabrak's sinister presence from the moment he touched down on Tatooine, and so he had been hiding in the sand at the Lars home, waiting for him to arrive. Kenobi burst out of the sand, lightsaber already activated, ready to close the old wound. Their battle was incredibly fierce, and even more deadly than the duel between A'Sharad Het. With Maul's new cybernetic legs, he seemed even more dangerous than he was all those years ago. But Kenobi was not holding back either. Unlike on Naboo, he was level-headed, and he landed some brutal blows on his nemesis by punching off some of his horns, even slashing off his arm. In the end, Kenobi had Maul dead to rights by disarming him and aiming his lightsaber hilt at Maul's forehead. All Obi-Wan had to do was press the ignition and end him. But once again, the call of the dark side returned. Fury welled up within Kenobi as he was flooded with memories of Qui-Gon being murdered, Padme being choked, and Anakin's screaming face. Kenobi hesitated, knowing that he needed to end the threat but not wanting to give in to his bloodlust. But luckily, he wouldn't have to. A single well-placed blaster bolt pierced Maul's skull, snuffing out his life in an instant. Owen Lars, bleeding from the face, had got back up and shot him with what was left of the rifle. Kenobi was tired from the duel and grateful that he didn't have to execute with a finishing blow. He would check to make sure that Luke was alright before going off to bury Maul's body in the desert. But after the entire ordeal, Owen told Obi-Wan to never return. As Ben carried off Maul's body, he promised to always be right there for Luke, even if the boy could not see him. Kenobi had fulfilled his duty, and even though it had only been about 3 years, he had begun to cement himself as a legend on the sandy world. Settlers heard whispers of him. The Tusken Raiders both feared and respected him, and few beings ever went near the Lars homestead because of him. From this moment forth, the Lars family rarely ever had problems with the Tuskens or any other criminal syndicates coming to their home, for there was a ghost of a man that kept a hedge of protection around them, a silent sentinel who stood at a distance, ready for any moment that he would be needed. And although Luke Skywalker scarcely knew him, Ben Kenobi remained his watchful guardian throughout his entire life. As for Kenobi himself, he had soon been accepted for training under Qui-Gon Jinn yet again. Now he had forgiven himself and thrown off the heavy burdens that he had placed on his own shoulders. General Kenobi was dead, but from his ashes came a wiser and a more thoughtful version of himself. And that brings us to our final entry. Chapter 3, Old Ben Kenobi. It is said that the twin sons of Tatooine age humans twice as fast as any other world. Their harsh light and oppressive heat bleaches hair and wrinkles skin, making a 30-year-old man look in his 50s and a 50-year-old man look in his 70s. This was indeed what happened to Ben Kenobi during his long stay. 13 years had passed since his arrival to Tatooine, and his outward appearance falsified his age. However, this all worked to his advantage. By now, Obi-Wan Kenobi was in the Empire's top 8 most wanted men in the entire galaxy. Although it was known that he had survived Order 66, he hadn't been publicly seen since the Battle of Utapau. The image of Obi-Wan in the Imperial files was from the days of the Clone Wars, and it frequently appeared in Stormtrooper recruitment videos as late as 0 BBY. The Empire would use some visual programs to alter their own image of Obi-Wan of what they think that he would look like at his current age of 51. However, Tatooine had ensured that Ben Kenobi looked far older than that, to the point of being completely unrecognizable from his former self. Years of isolation had not been kind to the Jedi Master. Then again, few things were. As of now, Kenobi had simply made a new life for himself. He had become accustomed to his role and to his loneliness. It was no longer a suffocating feeling that would mug him in the night, robbing him of sleep and choking him of joy. The ache of regret had long since dulled, and the silence of the desert around him was no longer accusatory, but acceptable, even peaceful. But there was one day in 6 BBY when a sudden disturbance in the Force rocked that peace. The Force struck him with a 4-worded message: Luke is in danger. He had been fixing a evaporator outside of his hut when the sensation hit him. It was a disturbance in the Force so distinctive that Ben immediately knew that it had come from Luke. He wondered if Luke had somehow generated it. Opening himself up to the Force, he received a vision that gave him the story. A now 13-year-old Luke Skywalker and his friend Wendy had attempted to entertain themselves by riding Wendy's pet dewback around the Jundland Wastes, but when a sandstorm hit, the dewback threw them off into Beggar's Canyon. Even in clear weather, people got lost in the twisted canyons, and it was dusk. The thought to contact Owen Lars crossed Obi-Wan's mind, but he dismissed it. The Lars homestead was some 70 kilometers beyond Luke and Wendy's position, and knowing Owen, the stubborn man would get himself lost or killed looking for Luke. Ben had quite a ways to go to reach Luke, but luckily his private taxi was arriving. A Jawa sandcrawler was driving by in a hurry. Ben would reach through the Force into the sandcrawler and into the Jawa chief's mind. He planted a message that the chief should stop and check the engines. After a brief negotiation, the Jawas agreed to drop Ben off at the destination, and by the time he got there, the sandstorm was still at its full tempest. Kenobi anxiously made his way through the weather, searching the canyon. It now occurred to him that this may indeed be the day when he actually met young Luke. He had devoted the entire remainder of his life and happiness to keeping Luke safe, but he had still never actually met the boy. For years he had been looking forward to the day when he could, but he wasn't sure if this would be that day. To respect Owen, he planned on trying to help the two youths out of the canyon without revealing his presence there, but that was wishful thinking. Moments later, he heard an ear-splitting roar echoing down the canyon halls. He knew it. A Krayt Dragon. Ben immediately ran down through the maze, using the Force to find his way. He felt that Luke was still alive, terrified, but alive. Sprinting through the canyon, Ben felt to his irritation that his heart was beginning to pound. This was the first time he was confronting the limitations of his age. He would use the Force to soothe his heartbeat and refresh his body to keep it moving, which was something he only used to do after a full day of intense battle, not a few minutes of a sprint. Soon he came upon the opening in the canyon where a wild Krayt was slamming against the walls. Luke and Wendy were crying in one of the crevices while the dragon slammed its head against the outer wall attempting to reach them. Just like with the Jawa chief, Ben Kenobi reached inside its primitive mind and planted a coercive thought. As hungry as the mighty dragon may have been, it was not able to resist the Force-imbued suggestion that it was very, very sleepy. The Krayt Dragon backed away from the boys and fell down, settling into a deep sleep. Ben Kenobi approached Luke Skywalker and met his eyes for the very first time. It occurred to him that Luke was now the same age that Obi-Wan had been when he first made his trip to Ilum as a Jedi Padawan, and it was there where he made the decision that this was the day he was going to introduce himself to Luke. Ben led the boys out of the winding canyon and into the calm center of the sandstorm's eye where they could travel in better weather. Wendy had passed out from exhaustion, prompting Ben to carry him on his back. But as they traveled, Ben and Luke had their very first conversation. Luke was upset that Wendy's pet dewback had died to the Krayt Dragon. The two boys cared for it and had taken it for a ride out of indignation when other boys were making fun of them. Luke blamed himself for the dewback paying for his mistake. But Ben told him that he had learned a valuable lesson about how one's choices ripple through the lives of others. He was thankful when he saw that, unlike Anakin, Luke actually listened and understood. Soon they would come to rest for shelter at Ben's hut as the storm began to pick up. Not to mention, Ben found his back aching from carrying the other boy. Just another rueful reminder that he was no longer a Jedi in his prime. Luke and Ben got to know each other a little bit more that night. Though, just like with Annalene 13 years earlier, Ben had to avoid giving specific answers about himself and his reason for living in the Jundland Wastes. But in their brief conversation, Ben found himself impressed by the young boy's politeness and his strength of character. The next morning, Ben returned the two boys to the Lars homestead, where Owen, Beru, and Wendy's parents were there waiting. The boys excitedly told their guardians about Ben, how he had saved them from the Krayt Dragon. Wendy's parents were overjoyed, but Owen was less so. Instead, he shoved Kenobi away and commanded him to get off of his property. Kenobi returned to his isolation in the Jundland Wastes, his life-dedicating job remaining a thankless endeavor. But he had at least gotten to meet the young boy, the boy that he had sacrificed so much for. This reinvigorated the Jedi, prompting him to create the legacy that he would leave behind for a young Luke. This came in the form of a journal written in the leather-bound book that he had found in the junk shop over a decade earlier. There, Obi-Wan began to document his life story. He started from his earliest memories in the Jedi Temple, spoke of Qui-Gon, his trials as a Padawan, building his lightsaber, then his eventual knighthood, and training of Luke's father. Ben would be careful to write that Vader and Anakin were two separate people, maintaining the illusion that he would eventually tell Luke. He also spoke of the Clone Wars, how it all began, the parties that participated in it, and his own experience in the battles. He wrote about dueling Count Dooku, chasing General Grievous, and the terrorism of Asajj Ventress. He would divulge his secret passions with Siri Tachi, and later Duchess Satine. He'd share stories about what the Jedi Order was like, their structures, the High Council, and even what old Yoda was like back then. He also shared the Jedi teachings, their ways, but in the form of personal anecdotes. Topping it all off, he included hand-drawn schematics of a lightsaber construction, along with the process of crafting a synthetic lightsaber crystal should Luke be unable to obtain a natural one. This knowledge, Ben knew, would serve Luke and the future of the Jedi, and so he needed to ensure that it would not fall into the wrong hands. When he had completed his multi-volume work, he stored them in a locked box made of boa wood. He then placed flash packets all around the inside of each one of the books, as well as the inside of the box itself. He then locked every book, and the box with clasps that could only be opened with either a password or Luke Skywalker's thumbprint. If anyone tried to open the box or any of the books forcefully, the flash packets would activate and burst it into flames. Luckily though, this never happened, and years into the future, Luke would return to Tatooine and was able to claim this valuable inheritance. This was also why his second lightsaber resembled Obi-Wan so closely, because Ben had drawn the schematics based on his own lightsaber's design. It was all complete, a Jedi compendium and the entire reason for the remainder of Ben's life. He knew deep down that Luke would need these things someday, and that someday would happen several years later. In 0BBY, Ben Kenobi started his morning as he always did. By now, the old wizard he saw in his reflection was a far cry from the suave, auburn-haired Jedi Knight of his youth. When he had gone to sleep the night before, he had anticipated that this day would be exactly the same as the other 19 years. But when he awoke, the Force was stirring. It was stirring so strongly, in fact, Ben found that he simply could not resist its will. He felt compelled to go for a walk into the Jundland Wastes, and so he pulled up his hood and did so. It would not be long before the same disturbance hit him now as it had 6 years prior. Luke was in danger. And when he came over the ridge, he saw sand people digging through a land speeder with Luke's unconscious body on the ground. Remembering the settlers' call from way back, Kenobi summoned the Force and let out a convincing mimicry of a Krayt Dragon's hunting call. The forgery was a success, and the Tusken Raiders ran for their lives. Ben checked Luke's pulse and brought him back to consciousness, and there he found himself at the crossroads of destiny. Like ghosts straight out of his past, he found himself in front of R2-D2 and C-3PO, both of Anakin's droids. He knew 3PO had his memory wiped, but R2 somewhat recognized him and was blabbering on about needing to speak with Obi-Wan Kenobi, a name that Ben had not heard in a very long time. Taking them all back to his hut, Kenobi divulged to Luke the story of his father, and for the first time in well over a decade, he revealed himself as a Jedi. Ben Kenobi had foregone all of the caution and guarding that he usually had with every interaction with other sentient life. Swept up by the will of the Force, he found himself being almost completely transparent about himself with Luke. The only part he made sure to misdirect was Luke's query on how Anakin had died. The time was not right, so he followed the instruction of Qui-Gon Jinn. He obeyed his master and lied to Luke. He then gave him his father's lightsaber. It brought Kenobi pride to see Luke wielding the weapon of a Jedi. It suited him. The whole time he spoke with Luke, Ben couldn't help but notice just how much like Anakin he really was. The way that he fixed 3PO with ease was reminiscent of Anakin's technological brilliance, and Ben had already heard rumors of how Luke had become an excellent pilot. In fact, Owen had grounded him not too long ago for participating in the perilous T-16 race in Beggar's Canyon. Interacting with Luke was like deja vu for Kenobi, only this time, he had the opportunity to do it right. Then came the transmission from Leia Organa, the daughter of Anakin Skywalker. Upon seeing the message, Ben Kenobi now fully understood what was happening. He was brought to Luke in the desert, and Leia was giving him the call to return to the fight. It was surely the will of the Force moving at rapid pace, and he was now not able to resist it. The time had finally come. Though he had not known that this would happen when he awoke that morning, the truth was undeniable. Obi-Wan Kenobi's exile was over. Ben enticed Luke to join him in his quest, but the boy was too worried about his uncle's reaction. Kenobi understood and planned to take him back home like usual. However, he silently hoped that he would be able to convince Luke along the way. But before they left, Kenobi asked to borrow Anakin's lightsaber so that he could put a belt ring on it. When he took it back inside the hut, he held the saber carefully so as to not smudge the fingerprints. He then scanned those fingerprints and quickly programmed them into the box's lock. Everything had now reached its completion. The winds no longer brought silence, but a call to move on at last. Dusk of the twin suns had now fallen on the mission. Obi-Wan Kenobi had sacrificed everything, his life, his youth, his happiness, but it was over. He had done it all to protect Luke, and he had succeeded. The galaxy now had its new hope, and Ben would deliver it to them just as he had once delivered the infant Skywalker in a swaddled blanket. When Obi-Wan, Ben Kenobi left his hovel, he had the striking feeling that it would be the very last time, and he didn't look back. This is the entire exile of Obi-Wan Kenobi as told from Legends continuity. This was an intensely emotional journey, one which was told much slower than other stories in the Star Wars universe. The events of the Clone Wars had come to a sudden and a climactic end, and anyone who had gone through the events of Revenge of the Sith would be traumatized. But Obi-Wan had been right in the epicenter of it all. It was definitely going to take a while for him to get back on his feet, and with Qui-Gon remaining silent for a good part of the beginning, it was a wonder that he got through the emotional trial at all. Researching this holocron was an interesting journey in and of itself. Most of these stories are told between two novels, Kenobi, written by John Jackson Miller, and The Life and Legend of Obi-Wan Kenobi, written by Ryden Winham. Sometimes Legends authors have a tendency to contradict one another, making the timeline difficult for us to follow when we make these documentaries. However, we were pleasantly surprised to see that these two authors had done painstaking work to ensure that their books lined up with one another. Winham's Life and Legend went through dozens of books and comics, summarizing them into one continuous story with extra insight from Obi-Wan. And Miller's Kenobi was written with Life and Legend in mind, slotting it perfectly within the other book's continuity. I found myself fascinated by the Kenobi novel because despite the book's title, the entire story is told from the perspective of the Tatooine settlers and the Tusken Raiders. Annalene is the main character, and most of the story is about her and her outside looking in on Ben Kenobi. The book is really everyone else's reaction to Ben rather than a story from his own telling. The only parts of the book that are told from Obi-Wan's own perspectives are the occasional paragraphs of meditation where he converses with Qui-Gon. But despite that bold storytelling choice, I found Kenobi to be a very entertaining book. Annalene was a compelling character all her own, and I found myself becoming attached to her plight. I almost felt personally betrayed by Oren Galk. This is one of those Star Wars sleepers that I highly recommend. The only outlier of these was The Last of the Jedi books, written by Judy Blundell, which came later since they were summarized in The Life and Legend. Those are the books that deals with Obi-Wan's adventures with Ferus Olin. The first two books of the Last Jedi series were A Desperate Mission and Dark Warning. Interestingly enough, the series was originally pitched as being a continuation of Obi-Wan's adventures post-Episode 3. However, Lucasfilm turned down that idea because they said Obi-Wan would never leave Luke for an extended period of time without a valid reason. So they gave him one more daring adventure before having the series switch focus to Ferus Olin. But I personally wouldn't have minded if they had found a reason to justify giving Obi-Wan more adventures and lore. The only part I wish these books actually dive into more was Obi-Wan's training with Qui-Gon. We never actually learned the specific process of retaining one's identity after death and becoming a Force ghost. Though I suppose some books reference how to do it, like when Obi-Wan helped Anakin do it in The Rise and Fall of Darth Vader, but we never get the process fully spelled out here. Obi-Wan Kenobi remains one of the most compelling fixtures in all of Star Wars lore. His exile wasn't simply a retreat from the galaxy, but a battle of a different kind, a battle of choosing not to fight. After surviving the brutality of the Clone Wars, witnessing the fall of the Jedi, and watching Anakin slip into darkness, Obi-Wan was forced into a life of silence and isolation that carried its own kind of weight. Yet despite that immense burden, he remained a Jedi. He learned to live with his grief instead of being consumed by it. He protected Luke, he rebuilt himself, and he continued to walk the path of compassion and patience when anger and despair would have been far easier. It's this unwavering commitment, Obi-Wan's ability to stay true to the light even when surrounded by loss, that makes Obi-Wan Kenobi not just a hero, but one of the greatest and most enduring characters in the entire Star Wars mythos. If you've made it this far into the documentary, then it has truly been an honor to have you with us here in the archives. We hope you enjoyed this deep exploration into the long, quiet, and often heartbreaking exile of Obi-Wan Kenobi, one of the most enduring legends of the Jedi Order. Thank you for spending your time with us, for diving into the lore, and for keeping these stories alive. Until our next journey together, may the Force be with you always.